What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week is episode 8, and it is still February. This is still right here. We're still covering Lord of the Rings. This time, we are doing The Two Towers. If you missed my review on Fellowship of the Ring, you can check right up there, I believe. That's the right direction? I think so. You can check right up there for that review. There isn't really much to say because, like I said last week, I did cover Fellowship of the Ring, which is part 1 of the Lord of the Rings. It is definitely as good as people say is what I was able to convey in that review. So this time, let's just jump right into discussing whether The Two Towers continues that trend. Now, I will start this one off by saying, since I didn't really do that in the first, in that other review, right off the bat, these are non-spoiler reviews. There aren't going to be any spoilers. There will be a massive, not necessarily massive, there will be a longer, full series review and discussion episode that I do in March that will cover all 3 of these books and maybe discuss a little bit of spoilery type things, but these ones are spoiler-free. And The Two Towers covers books 3 and 4, so when I reference 3 and 4, that's what I'm referring to. Hopefully that doesn't get too confusing. So, just as I started Fellowship of the Ring with what my history was with reading that book, I will start this video by doing the same thing. I originally read The Two Towers, I believe, when I was a freshman in high school, or I started it. I don't think I finished until closer to the end of the summer after my freshman year. Like, it took me a very long time to read The Two Towers for some reason. Back at that time, like I said, I was reading, like I mentioned in the previous video anyways, I was reading mostly just YA, and a lot of this adult fantasy type of structuring and stuff like that felt too slow and boring, so it was hard for me to read a lot of it at a time. So because of that, it took me forever to read this book, even though, for whatever reason, when I read Fellowship right before it, it went by super quick. I think part of it was because when I read too much in one series, it's easy for me to burn out and lose interest if I read too much in too short of a period of time. So I tried to avoid that this time, and I'm happy to say that The Two Towers did not take me however many months or more. This time it only took me a couple weeks, which is great. I do remember liking The Two Towers a lot more than Fellowship of the Ring the first time that I read it, despite how long it took me to read it. But then cut to December 2021 and reading this book for the second time. And I think I'm a little bit more mixed on it this time than I was on Fellowship. So let's figure out why. Let's start again with what are some of the best elements of The Two Towers. As I alluded to in the last video, the cut from book 2 to book 3 is very well done. This book starts off fantastic. The pacing is chosen to separate the overall end arc of Fellowship into the 2 separate stories of The Two Towers because of what happens at the end of Fellowship, which I suppose isn't necessarily too big of a spoiler because the chapter title. The very final chapter of Fellowship of the Ring is called The Breaking of the Fellowship. That's all I'll say. And because of the events of that chapter, books 3 and 4 in The Two Towers follow 2 separate storylines. Although they take place during the same period of time, they are 2 separate storylines. It doesn't cut, however, because of the way that Fellowship was finished, the start of book 3 starts off in a way that somehow doesn't cut off the action. In fact, it picks up right as the end of Fellowship. In fact, I think in some way you could even say that it picked up maybe even moments before the end of Fellowship. They're very closely connected. The story that issues in book 3 is amazing, with very great viewpoints and fantastic story moments. I love all of book 3. Book 3 is just super good. Again, no spoilers, but many of the best story moments that occur in The Two Towers are in book 3 because of the way that they satisfy some of the expositional setup done back in book 2 in Fellowship of the Ring. I did mention last time that the characters aren't the deepest, but that they're diverse and delightful to read. This is proved even more true here. You get a deeper feel for who part of these characters are, even to an extent that wasn't seen in Fellowship. And this is mostly true in book 3, but even book 4 as well. You just get a deeper feel for who these characters are, and you really start to enjoy them more. Book 4 is a little bit different, mostly seeking to just push forward the overall plot that is set forth at the very beginning of book 2. I'm admittedly a little bit more mixed on book 4 as a whole, but that's kind of a discussion for that later video that I mentioned coming in March, covering the whole series. Some other great things about The Two Towers is that it has probably the best example of an unsettling or even scary chapter in all of The Lord of the Rings. With chapter 9 of book 4, even after the creepiness of chapter 2 of book 4. Chapter 2 of book 4 has some really unsettling concepts and themes that feel a little bit tense and just kind of make your chest just tighten a little bit. Chapter 9 of book 4 is pretty terrifying in a couple of different ways, if I'm going to be completely honest. That's how I felt when reading them. Not the same way that I was scared reading certain scenes in like Salem's Lot by Stephen King or anything like that, but there are some very unsettling and creepy moments. I mentioned this in the Fellowship of the Ring video, that Lord of the Rings as a whole was very positive and joyful, and that it's not afraid to get uncomfortable. This is especially true in part 2, The Two Towers, because of the way that it's set. You don't know what's going to get accomplished, if anything, in part 3, so you just kind of have this dismal, depressing kind of mood throughout, especially after some sad events that have just happened prior. So this kind of setup in tone and the way that it's carried out is very good. Similar to the endings of book 1 and 2 and Fellowship of the Ring being fantastic, the endings of both books 3 and 4 are absolutely fantastic. Book 3's ending is a glorious setup for what's to come in book 5. Same with book 4 into 6, but there's something about these tie-ins that work so well, despite them being completely separate storylines. And now that I've gone into all of this, what are kind of some of the worst elements of The Two Towers? Well, there's not as much to talk about here, specifically because Fellowship of the Ring has more objective parts of it that are not going to work for some people. Two Towers is a little bit different. If you've gotten through Fellowship of the Ring, there's not really much about Two Towers to complain about, but here are some things that I wanted to note. Each books 3 and 4 are good stories on their own, but I'm not particularly a huge fan of the strict split. As I said, they carry two different storylines with different characters and what's going on. It makes more sense to read them in this format from a continuity perspective, but due to the side-by-side timeline content, as I said, I admittedly am not a big fan of this organization. I'm generally a fan of going back and forth and covering things that are happening at the same time, rather than covering all of one and then all of the other, because it kind of creates this disconnect between what's happening, even though they're happening at the same time. As I said, the endings of both of these books lead right into the beginnings of the two books that occur in Return of the King, but Return of the King handles these separate storylines a lot better than The Two Towers does, in my opinion. More on that in the next video. The organization as set forth in The Two Towers can be, or can feel a little bit disconnected, at least to me. I did mention a little bit earlier in this review that I'm a little bit mixed on book 4. Now, the main reason for this is because of the structure of it. It feels a lot more travel. It feels like it's just a lot more travel, like book 2 and Fellowship, but without the rest of the Fellowship, to not say too much. Book 1 was very good because of the way that you have these characters, and then the beginnings of book 2, and book 2 as a whole, are very enjoyable because you have all of these characters that are interacting and going through this journey together. In book 4, you don't have the whole group, so they feel a little bit more dry. They're a little bit less enjoyable to go through. It is important to note, though, that these problems only really exist for me in the middle chapters of Book 4. Chapters 1 and 2 are very good, as well as chapters 8 through 10 being great. But the middle ones are definitely a little bit slow. I mean, there are some things that happen in it that are kind of cool, and now that I'm actually thinking about it right now, mean a lot more to me because of the way that they pay off in Return of the King. But in the moment of reading Book 4, they can be a little bit slow and hard to get through. At least they were for me. It's just admittedly a little bit weird that I feel this way about Book 4, because Book 4 was my favorite of all 4 of them when I originally read Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers back in my freshman and maybe even sophomore year of high school, because I don't exactly remember when. But Book 4 was my favorite of the 4 of them when I read these 2 volumes back then, but up to this point in the narrative, it's probably my least favorite, which is a little bit surprising. However, there's overall not much to dislike, as I mentioned before. The Two Towers is very good, and since it is devoid of like Tom Bombadil in the prologue and stuff, which are the most polarizing parts of The Lord of the Rings, there's not much to dislike about The Two Towers. And now we go right into my overall thoughts and observations. You'll see that this video is plenty shorter than the last review because there's not as much to specifically talk about for readers who may not like certain things. My overall thoughts and observations are that The Two Towers is a worthy continuation of what Fellowship begins. There are some hiccups in the pacing of Book 4, in my opinion, but the endings of both of these are well worth the journey, especially once you consider what they lead into with Return of the King. Just as with Fellowship, I'm going to list some of my favorite chapters. My favorite chapters of Book 3 are probably chapters 2 through 4 and 11, and these chapters are so good that it makes Book 3 one of the best in all 6 of the books of The Lord of the Rings. My favorite chapters of Book 4, are chapters 1 and 2, and then 8 through 10. Like I said, that middle section really drags, but the beginning and end of Book 4 are good enough that they make the favorite chapters list. I mean, you could say that they're by default, but they are genuinely very enjoyable chapters. And now that we've basically finished covering The Two Towers, let's just kind of get into the conclusion. I loved this book. It definitely went a lot slower than Fellowship of the Ring did for me. I probably like Fellowship better than The Two Towers, but that's a discussion for another day. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like and subscribing and ringing the bell, all the fancy YouTube stuff that I feel obligated to say. If you want all of my videos in one spot, you can use this YouTube channel, or you can go to seasonalproductions.com, where all of my important YouTube content is backlogged, as well as all of my writing content that I do. So if you're interested in any of that, go ahead and go to seasonalproductions.com again and bookmark it and check that out. I would greatly appreciate it. This is the end of this video. Next week, the last Monday of February, we are going to be covering Return of the King, Part 3 of The Lord of the Rings. So stick around for that. It is going to be a thrilling conclusion. This is the end of this. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll be back again next week with another episode of the Book Binge.